here with Robert Erikson, professor of political science at Columbia University, modeler of election outcomes extraordinaire, to talk about a paper you presented here, which was interested me because it sort of gets at what I perceive to be something of a debate between some political scientists and some campaigners and journalists about whether campaigns matter. Political science sometimes implies that they don't, particularly in general elections for president, and consultants who get paid by campaigns, we all want to feel that they do matter. First of all, let's talk about what you studied here. What data did you look at?
I looked at the National Election Study data from 1952 to 2008. The National Election Study is conducted every 4 years, every presidential election. It has been by the people at the University of Michigan. And they interview the same people in the fall campaign in September and October. Then they re-interview them after the election, ask them how they voted. So in this case, what I did was simply compare their vote choice before the election with their report of how they actually did vote.
How they did vote.
And to simplify it further, I just looked at people who did vote for a major party candidate and had a major party choice the first time around. Okay. So these are either stand patters or people who switched.
So you were able to look at individual level change.
That's right.
And what did you find?
I found that over these many elections that 95% of the respondents claimed to have voted the same way they said they were going to vote in the fall in the first interview. So in other words, only 1 in 20 switched. Of course, that 1 in 20 can be important.
Right. Now, you've done, this was sort of building on a previous work that you've done where you looked at the aggregate level of change in these same elections.
That's right. This is part of a larger project with my colleague Christopher Valesian at Temple University. And we have a project which we call the Timeline on Presidential Campaigns, which we plan to turn into a book. And so we've looked at elections in the aggregate. In this particular paper, we're looking at individual respondents in the surveys. And so we find that 5% who switch, and also try to find when the 5% switched. And we can do that because we know the date, how many days before the election the first interview took place. So we can make some estimates that way about when the switching occurred.
So my memory of the charts that you put up and the charts that we've, that Charles Franklin has done on some of these same things, Gallup has, is that there's a lot of stability from the convention forward to November, from September through September and October, but there's much more movement, particularly around the conventions.
That's
so
right, yeah.
Would that imply that 5% switching is a much bigger number early? I mean, we have to guess, but it looks as though there's more switching around beforehand.
Yeah, so this would be our educated guess, but
right.
Probably much more switching occurs around convention time. That's probably the one time when we can expect there's going to be a lot of conversion, people change their mind. Another time, oddly, is probably at the very last minute, like the last day, election day, a few days before, and some people only then begin to make up their mind. So we know that because the final polls, as good as they are, still can't get it quite that accurately.
There were two things, I'm not sure we're going to have time to get to them both, but I want to ask about, so the presidential general election is one kind of campaign. What can, based on just your knowledge of other surveys and campaigns generally, how can you apply this to other contexts like primary elections or more down ballot races where the candidates aren't quite as well known?
Well, when the candidates aren't very, very well known, and particularly when it's a primary election, the voting, as pollsters all know, is very fluid. So that, for example, the one bad mark and otherwise good record of the pollsters in 2008 was the well-known failure to predict Hillary Clinton's win in the New Hampshire primary. But that can occur because voters are making up their minds very fluidly when, in that case, there were all Democratic voters trying to figure out which of the two attractive to them Democratic candidates was the better. And so perhaps you can't blame the pollsters for getting that
right. I was going to ask one more thing, which you touched on in your presentation. When you looked at the National Election Study data, the switching was greater, as you would expect, among people who said they made up their minds later. Is that right?
That's right.
Can you explain that a little bit?
So after the election, these voters were asked, when did you make up your mind? For example, on election day, the final 2 weeks, during the campaign, the conventions, or earlier. And most people chose a very early date, and only a handful, or let's say roughly 2% said on election day, but those people are poor. And maybe 5% said during the last 2 weeks, another 8% said during the campaigns. That's not very many, and we find that the closer was the first interview was the election, of course, the more consistency with the final choice. But it was only a difference such that 60 days out, about 93% stuck with their choice. The people interviewed about the last day of the campaign, 97% stuck with their choice. So it did make a big difference, but clearly the campaign did matter.
Okay. Robert Erikson, thank you very much.
I think we got it.